Welcome back to another deep dive into the darkest corners of Fallout lore. What you're about to hear is a confession that exposes a conspiracy 2 centuries in the making. Today's story reveals a hidden civilization in the Arctic that's been controlling the wasteland since the bombs fell, manipulating every caravan route, every faction war, every plague outbreak. And in 3 years, they're planning to cut off all supplies and watch 40 million people starve before emerging as your saviors. This isn't random wasteland violence or the chaos of nuclear aftermath. This is calculated genocide disguised as humanitarian aid, 200 years of invisible control, and one dying woman's desperate attempt to warn you before it's too late. She gave up everything, including her life, to expose the truth about the supply chains you depend on and the cold that's coming from the north. And if you genuinely enjoy this kind of dark storytelling, consider subscribing and liking the channel, but only if you like the content. Now, let's descend into the frozen darkness of the Arctic Commonwealth and discover what they've been hiding from the wasteland for 2 centuries. I need to tell you something before my body gives out completely, and I need you to understand that everything you think you know about survival in the wasteland is a lie someone designed for you. My fingers are numb as I record this. The warmth of Nevada feels like acid on my skin, and in 18 days my organs will shut down one by one because my DNA was never meant to exist this far south. But before I die, screaming in a climate my genes call hell, you need to know what's coming in 3 years, and why every caravan, every trader, every merchant from California to the Commonwealth is going to wake up one morning to find their entire supply chain has vanished overnight. My name doesn't matter yet. You'll figure it out if you're smart. But what does matter is that for 41 years, I believed I was saving your lives. I grew up in a place where the sun never rises for months at a time, where the temperature outside drops to 80 below zero, where 15 million people live in interconnected cities so deep underground that the nuclear fire never touched us. We called it home. You would call it something else if you knew it existed. We've been watching you since the day the bombs fell, tracking every settlement, every faction, every mouth that needs feeding. And for 2 centuries, we've been the invisible hand that kept you alive just long enough to be useful. I was born in what we called Vault 7 North, 3rd generation, which means my grandparents were the ones who sealed the doors in 2077 while the world above burned. They told us stories about the dead world, about the radiation and the monsters, and the desperate survivors clawing through the ruins. We had videos, sensor readings updated daily, atmospheric analysis that showed toxic levels of everything that could kill a human being. Every morning in school they showed us the numbers: radiation, lethal; temperature incompatible with human life; air quality poisonous. And then they showed us the supply manifests, the shipments we sent south, the food and medicine and weapons that kept those poor surface dwellers from going extinct. I believed every word. Why wouldn't I? The Arctic Commonwealth wasn't like your vaults. We didn't have any of those Vault-Tec experiments, no social manipulation, no testing variables on trapped populations. We were the real deal, the ones the government actually wanted to save. 15 million people spread across 30 vaults from Alaska to Greenland, connected by magnetic levitation trains moving through tunnels 400 miles per hour, so deep the bombs couldn't even scratch the walls. We had agriculture, manufacturing, research facilities, everything needed to rebuild civilization properly. We were the seed vault for humanity, or so they told us. The lie was beautiful because it was mostly true. We did have everything we needed to survive. We did send supplies south. We did track the wasteland's recovery. Where they lied was about why. I spent my childhood in the agricultural sectors, learning to grow food in hydroponic towers that stretched half a mile high, watching the harvest quotas that always seemed slightly larger than what we needed to feed ourselves. The excess went south, they said, to help the survivors. I felt proud every time I saw those shipping containers loaded onto the southbound trains. I was helping people. I was part of something noble. When I turned 18, I joined Logistics Division because I wanted to do more. I wanted to be part of the system that kept those survivors alive. They accepted me immediately. I was 3rd generation pure bloodline, genetically modified for cold weather survival, top marks in efficiency analysis. Perfect candidate for someone who would spend their life managing supply routes to a dead world. They put me in Training Group 7, gave us the basic overview of Operation Tundra, showed us the maps of distribution networks, taught us how to calculate optimal resource allocation across vast distances. Operation Tundra was the most complex logistics operation in human history, they told us during orientation. 200 years of continuous supply distribution across an entire continent without ever revealing our existence. Every major settlement in the wasteland had unknowingly been receiving our goods since 2090. The Crimson Caravan Company, the gun runners, Far Harbor traders, the water merchants before they collapsed. All of them had been distributing products that originated in Arctic manufacturing facilities. We made it, we shipped it through carefully designed channels, and they sold it thinking they'd scavenged it or manufactured it themselves. I spent 20 years in distribution analysis, tracking shipment routes, monitoring delivery, success rates, adjusting for seasonal variations and faction conflicts. I got good at it, really good. I could look at a supply line and tell you within 3% accuracy how much would reach the destination and how much would be lost to raiders or wildlife. I developed algorithms that increased efficiency by 17% across the northern routes. I got promoted 5 times. I thought I was saving lives with mathematics. The numbers were beautiful in their own way. We could track birth rates across the entire wasteland, measure the impact of our medical supplies on infant mortality, watch settlement populations grow when we increased food shipments. I had graphs showing how many lives were saved by each shipment of antibiotics, how many communities survived winters because of our preserved food, how many faction wars ended quicker because both sides had access to our weapons. The data told a story of slow, steady recovery, humanity crawling back from the brink, and we were the invisible guardians making it possible. I remember the day I got my promotion to Strategic Analysis Division. I was 41 years old, had spent 2 decades watching numbers that represented human lives, had personally optimized routes that I genuinely believed were preventing famines and plagues. My supervisor called me into his office, congratulated me, told me I was ready to see the real scope of Operation Tundra. He handed me a data chip and told me to review it in the secure reading room before our meeting the next day. I was excited. I thought I was finally going to see the big picture, understand how all the pieces fit together. I loaded that chip expecting to find more detailed supply manifests, maybe population projections for the next 50 years, perhaps plans for eventual emergence and reintegration. What I found instead was a document titled Wasteland Dependency Analysis, 2-Century Review and Integration Protocol. I started reading and my hands went cold despite the climate-controlled room. The first section was called Addiction Metrics and Resource Suppression. They weren't saving the wasteland, they were cultivating it. Every supply route I'd optimized, every shipment I'd tracked, every life I thought I'd saved, was part of a system designed to ensure that no community, no faction, no settlement could ever become self-sufficient. The document laid it out in clinical detail. Agricultural supplies were carefully calibrated to prevent any region from developing sustainable farming. Medical shipments included just enough antibiotics to keep populations alive, but never enough to eliminate disease completely. Weapon distribution was managed to keep all factions equally armed, ensuring continuous low-level conflict that prevented any single group from growing powerful enough to expand territory or develop infrastructure. The faction wars everyone thinks are about ideology or resources or old-world grudges, we've been arming all sides for 200 years. The Brotherhood of Steel, the New California Republic, the Institute, the Railroad, every major faction, and 100 smaller ones, all of them buying weapons that we manufactured and seeded into the supply chain through front companies and carefully staged scavenging discoveries. We own abandoned military bases across the continent. We stock them with weapons, ammunition, armor, all with carefully degraded serial numbers that make them look pre-war. We have teams whose only job is to make sure the right faction finds the right cash at the right time. I found the population control studies next. Our scientists had been monitoring the surface like it was a lab experiment. Birth rates, death rates, mutation frequencies, faction strengths, resource distribution patterns, migration trends, everything you could possibly measure about a population, and they'd been using that data to calculate optimal population density for colonization. Too many people and they'd resist. Too few and there wouldn't be enough labor force. The target number was written right there in the file, 40 million survivors by 2090, dispersed across the continent in communities small enough to control but large enough to be economically useful. Current population, according to their estimates, 62 million, which meant we needed to reduce it by 22 million before emergence. The next section explained how we'd been releasing diseases, not radiation-induced mutations, not wasteland plagues that evolved naturally, engineered bioweapons released in carefully calculated amounts in targeted regions. The new plague had been bad enough before the war, killed tens of thousands. We'd been creating new strains, modified versions that spread slower but killed just as effectively, releasing them in population centers that exceeded our target density. I found release schedules, dates, locations, projected mortality rates. Vault City outbreak, 2203, engineered mnemonic variant, estimated 1,400 casualties, actual casualties, 1,162, classified as successful. Hub influenza, 2218, modified respiratory pathogen, estimated 800 casualties, actual casualties, 941, classified as acceptable variants. Rivet City intestinal plague, 2247, waterborne bacterial agent, estimated 2,000 casualties, actual casualties, 2,318, classified as successful, with notes for reduced dosage in future deployments. They'd killed millions, not through warfare or raiding or random wasteland violence, through deliberate biological warfare against people who thought they were just dealing with bad luck and harsh conditions. And I'd been part of it. Every supply route I optimized helped deliver those pathogens. Every efficiency increase I developed meant more communities were within reach of our distribution network. I'd spent 20 years thinking I was a humanitarian, and I'd actually been a logistics officer for genocide. The emergence plan was in the final section. In 2090, 3 years from now, every supply line we controlled would shut down simultaneously. Every caravan route, every trade network, every distribution channel, all of it would go dark overnight. Within 6 months, the wasteland would be starving. Within a year, the faction wars would escalate from skirmishes to total warfare as everyone fought over the scraps. The projected mortality rate was 70% in the first year, not from us directly, just from starvation and the wars that would erupt when the food stopped coming. Then we emerge. We come south with food, medicine, technology, solutions to every problem we created. We arrive as saviors to people desperate enough to accept any terms. The Commonwealth becomes Arctic Commonwealth territory. The NCR becomes a client state. Every settlement, every faction, every survivor becomes part of our economic system, or they die. Simple as that. The document called it integration through necessity. I call it colonization through engineered famine. I sat in that reading room for 6 hours, reading and rereading, hoping I'd misunderstood something, looking for any interpretation that didn't make me complicit in mass murder. There wasn't one. The data was too clear, the projections too detailed, the past results too well documented. This wasn't a contingency plan or a theoretical exercise. This was the plan, had always been the plan, and it was already in motion. 3 years until supply cut off. 3 years until 40 million people started dying. I tried the proper channels first. I filed a formal objection through the Ethics Review Board. I requested meetings with senior leadership. I cited the humanitarian principles I'd been taught, the values the Commonwealth supposedly represented. I wrote detailed analyses showing how integration could work without mass casualties, proposals for gradual emergence and cooperation instead of exploitation. I genuinely believed that if I could just get someone to listen, to really understand what we were doing, they'd see reason. Maybe the plan had made sense 200 years ago when they thought the surface was truly dead. But now, with communities rebuilding, factions stabilizing, civilization actually recovering, surely we could find a better way. If you're still with me after hearing this, hit that like and subscribe button. 2 weeks after I submitted my reports, I was called into a medical appointment I hadn't scheduled. They told me I'd been selected for genetic therapy, an exciting new treatment that would enhance my cognitive performance and reduce workplace stress. They said it was an honor to be chosen, that only the highest performing citizens received this opportunity. The nurse smiled when she said it, like she was congratulating me on winning something. I'd heard about genetic therapy before. Everyone had. It was what they offered to people who couldn't handle the stress of deep vault work, who needed mental health support after traumatic incidents, who showed signs of psychological instability. The treatment was always successful. People came back calm, happy, productive. They never talked about whatever had bothered them before. They never questioned anything, and they never worked in positions requiring strategic thinking again. They got reassigned to manual labor in the deep tunnels, where they spent the rest of their lives doing repetitive physical work with smiles on their faces. I said thank you and left the medical center. I went back to my quarters and started planning. If I raised more objections, they'd move up the appointment. If I tried to talk to colleagues, they'd know I was spreading dissent. If I did anything suspicious, they'd just grab me early. I had maybe 3 days before someone noticed I hadn't confirmed my therapy slot. I spent those 3 days collecting evidence. I used my strategic analysis clearance to copy everything I could access: population studies, disease release schedules, supply route databases, emergence protocols, casualty projections, everything that proved what the Arctic Commonwealth was planning. I downloaded it onto data chips rated for surface conditions, the kind we used for remote monitoring equipment. 43 chips, each one holding enough evidence to prove we'd been manipulating the wasteland for 2 centuries. On the 3rd night, I packed a surface suit rated for extreme conditions, grabbed as many supply packs as I could carry, and headed for the maintenance tunnels that connected our vault to the Alaskan surface access points. These tunnels weren't guarded because nobody in their right mind would use them. They led directly to the surface. Hundreds of miles of unheated passages through solid ice, temperatures that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. But I wasn't planning to be unprotected, and I'd studied those tunnels in my logistics training. I knew which ones led to abandoned monitoring stations, which stations still had functional surface equipment. The walk took 16 hours. The suit kept me alive, but I could feel the cold seeping through anyway, my modified physiology actually struggling with the temperature for the first time in my life because I knew what was waiting on the other side. The warmth, the death sentence coded into my DNA. My cells were designed for Arctic conditions, my blood chemistry optimized for extreme cold, my organs expecting temperatures that would give normal humans hypothermia. Going south would kill me. I'd known that since I first read the research on our genetic modifications in school, but I went anyway. I climbed out of that monitoring station into the Alaskan wasteland and started walking south. Every mile hurt more than the last. My skin started burning in temperatures that were barely above freezing. My lungs ached from breathing air that my body considered dangerously warm. My joints swelled as my temperature regulation systems tried and failed to adapt. The suit helped, but only so much. You can't fight your own genetics. You can only choose which death you prefer. I made it to the first settlement after 2 days of walking. They looked at me like I was a ghost. This person in Commonwealth tech, stumbling out of the north, half frozen, despite the suit's climate control. I told them I had information that I needed to reach someone in the NCR or the Brotherhood or the Minutemen, anyone with enough resources to do something with what I'd learned. They pointed me toward a caravan heading south. That was 3 weeks ago. I've made it as far as New Vegas, but I'm running out of time. My modified genetics are shutting down, one system at a time, because this temperature is what my cells consider lethal heat. The burning in my skin never stops now. I have constant fevers that don't respond to any medicine. My kidneys are starting to fail. My liver enzymes are critical. The doctors at the old Mormon fort say I have maybe 18 more days before the organ failure becomes irreversible. They're amazed I've survived this long. I tell them I had good motivation. The data chips are sitting in a safe deposit box at the Atomic Wrangler right now because I learned fast that carrying them made me a target. Twice already someone's tried to kill me for them, and I don't think they were random raiders. The Commonwealth knows I ran. They know what I took. And they've got assets down here you wouldn't recognize because they've been embedded in your world for longer than you've been alive. That merchant who always has the best pre-war tech, that caravan guard who seems to know every route through dangerous territory, that scientist in your settlement who just showed up one day with valuable skills could be one of ours. Probably is, if they're in any position of influence. We've had people in the wasteland since the first emergence teams went south in 2085, not to help, to monitor, to manipulate, to ensure our investments stayed profitable. They integrate into your communities, marry your people, have children who don't know what their parents really are. third-generation sleepers who genuinely believe they're wastelanders because their grandparents never told them the truth. We've got bloodlines in the NCR government, the Brotherhood of Steel, the Institute leadership. Anywhere that matters, anywhere that could threaten the plan, we've had eyes and hands for over a century. I found the infiltration databases when I was copying files. Every agent, every sleeper, every asset we've placed in the last 200 years. Names, positions, operational histories, success metrics. The Hub's Merchant Council, 3 of the 6 founders were our people. The initial Brotherhood of Steel formation had 2 Commonwealth observers embedded in the group, feeding us information about their technological capabilities and territorial ambitions. When the NCR formed, we made sure specific people ended up in specific positions, not controlling everything that would be too obvious, just nudging things in directions that kept them dependent on northern trade. The weapon designs everyone thinks the gunrunners invented, most of them came from our research facilities. We'd develop a new rifle or pistol, manufacture a few hundred units, and seed them into pre-war military bases that our teams had access to. 6 months later, a scavenging party would find the cache, sell the weapons to the gunrunners, and they'd reverse engineer our designs thinking they discovered lost technology. We got our weapons into circulation, they got credit for innovation, and nobody questioned where pre-war military bases kept getting new stockpiles 200 years after the bombs. The Crimson Caravan's reputation for crazy risk-taking that somehow always paid off? We made sure their routes avoided the worst dangers while their competitors ran into problems. Not every time. That would look suspicious, but enough that over decades, they built a reputation for success that was actually built on intelligence we provided through embedded assets. They thought they were just lucky or skilled. Really, they were following paths we'd cleared for them, avoiding ambushes we'd warned them about through carefully planted rumors, finding supply caches we'd staged for them to discover. I spent 3 days just reading through the asset reports, watching the pattern emerge. Every major development in Wasteland society for 2 centuries had Commonwealth fingerprints on it. The formation of stable governments, the establishment of trade routes, the resolution of certain conflicts, and the escalation of others, all of it guided by our agents toward the optimal outcome, a wasteland dependent enough to be controlled, stable enough to be productive, and divided enough to never unite against us. Do you want to know something that's going to make you question everything you think you know about your own history? The NCR's expansion north wasn't their idea. We wanted them to spread into Northern California and Oregon because those regions needed population density for our manufacturing centers to make economic sense after integration. So we arranged for certain discoveries. A vault full of agricultural equipment just when they needed it. A cache of water purification systems right before a drought. Military supplies that showed up exactly when the Brotherhood was becoming a threat. Each time the NCR thought they were getting lucky or that their scavenging teams were just that good. We've been writing your history while letting you think you were living it freely. Every time you thought you made a choice, we'd already structured the options. Every time you thought you got lucky, we'd staged the opportunity. Every time you thought you survived through skill or determination, we'd calculated the exact amount of support needed to keep you alive but not independent. 200 years of invisible manipulation, and most people never suspected a thing. The disease releases bothered me the most when I was reading through the files. I'd seen the statistics, but the individual reports made it real in a way numbers couldn't. Vault City 2203 wasn't just 1,400 casualties, it was specific people with names and families. I read the surveillance report filed by the agent who released the pathogen. He described standing in the market square, opening the vial into the ventilation system, and walking away while people shopped and talked and lived their last healthy hours. He noted the optimal dispersal pattern, the estimated infection rate, the projected timeline for symptom onset. 3 days later, he filed another report describing the outbreak's progression: fever, respiratory distress, the medical center overwhelmed, bodies piling up because they couldn't cremate them fast enough. He documented it all with clinical detachment. Infection rate 92% of projected target, mortality rate 83% of infected. Economic impact, moderate disruption to regional trade, expected recovery in 6 months. Psychological impact, increased religious activity, strengthened community bonds through shared trauma, decreased trust in outside traders. That last part was interesting to them. They'd learned that plague outbreaks made communities more insular, more suspicious of outsiders, more likely to restrict travel and trade, which was useful for keeping populations fragmented. Can't unite against a threat you don't know exists if you're too afraid of your neighbors to cooperate with them. So they'd release diseases strategically, not just to reduce population, but to maintain social divisions. The hub influenza in 2218 was released specifically because the merchant councils were starting to discuss federation, creating a unified trade network that would span from California to the Mojave. That kind of organization would have made them harder to control, might have led to someone noticing the patterns in supply availability. So we gave them a plague. 800 dead. The Federation talks collapsed as each settlement blamed the others for spreading disease, and trade networks fragmented back into isolated routes we could manage individually. Problem solved. I found myself wondering how many communities had almost achieved something great, almost unified or innovated, or built something that would have made them independent, only to have it destroyed by a plague that seemed like natural bad luck, but was actually our biological warfare. How much has the wasteland lost because we kept cutting them down every time they started to grow? The supply manipulation was more subtle, but just as devastating. Take food, for instance. We produce more than enough to feed the entire wasteland, have been for decades. Our agricultural facilities can output at levels that would make pre-war farms look primitive. But we've never sent enough to any one region to allow them to stop farming themselves. We send just enough to supplement local production, to make communities dependent on trade, but not so dependent they stop trying to feed themselves. Because if they stopped farming, they'd realize how much they relied on us, and they might start asking questions about where all this food comes from. Instead, we calibrate it precisely. Enough to prevent famines, but not enough to eliminate food scarcity. Enough to make trade necessary, but not enough to make anyone wealthy from it. Every settlement in the wasteland lives one bad harvest away from hunger, and they think that's just how the world works now. They don't realize they're being kept at exactly that level of vulnerability deliberately. The weapons trade is even more calculated. We manufacture arms for every faction, and we make sure everyone stays roughly equal in firepower. The Brotherhood gets energy weapons through mysterious pre-war caches they keep finding. The NCR gets conventional arms through the Gunrunners and Crimson Caravan. The Institute develops their own weapons, but we've had agents in their research division ensuring their progress stays within acceptable parameters. Raiders and smaller factions get whatever we need them to have to keep pressure on the major powers without actually threatening their existence. The goal is perpetual low-intensity conflict. Wars big enough to prevent any faction from growing too powerful, small enough that they don't collapse from the casualties. We've been managing the wasteland's warfare like a thermostat, adjusting the temperature by controlling weapon availability. Too much peace and someone might start expanding aggressively, building an empire we'd have trouble controlling. Too much war and populations drop below economically useful levels, so we maintain just the right amount of violence. I found the faction management protocols in the strategic files. Each major power has an optimal strength level calculated based on their territorial size, resource access, and relationship with other factions. When they start exceeding that level, we adjust the variables. Maybe their weapon shipments get hit by raiders more frequently. Maybe a plague breaks out in their recruiting territories. Maybe their enemies suddenly get access to better equipment. Whatever it takes to keep everyone in balance. The NCR's expansion toward New Vegas wasn't supposed to happen as fast as it did. They were exceeding their projected growth rate, so we arranged for increased resistance, made sure the cons had enough firepower to be a persistent problem, ensured the fiends stayed well armed and aggressive, supported the powder gangers' breakout to create another destabilizing element. Not enough to stop the NCR, just enough to slow them down and bleed them a little, keep their expansion within manageable parameters. Meanwhile, we supported the Legion through different channels, ensuring they stayed strong enough to threaten the NCR's eastern border, but not strong enough to actually conquer them. Same with the Brotherhood. We've been feeding them technology through planted caches, while simultaneously ensuring they remain isolationist and paranoid. Powerful in small numbers, but unable to recruit broadly enough to become a real empire. It's all a game to them, to us, to the people running this operation. The Strategic Council meets quarterly to review faction status and adjust our interventions. I read the meeting minutes going back 50 years. They discuss human lives and human suffering the way you discuss crop yields or manufacturing quotas. The Brotherhood's technology acquisition rate exceeds optimal parameters. Recommend reduction in cache deployment frequency. NCR population growth in the Northern Territories is below target. Recommend increased medical supply distribution to Shady Sands and surrounding settlements. They have maps of the entire continent color-coded by population density, resource richness, strategic value. Green zones are optimal, ready for integration. Yellow zones need population adjustment, either increase or decrease. Red zones are problematic, requiring intervention. I watched those maps change over decades of reports, watched the colors shift as our manipulations took effect, watched communities prosper or die based on decisions made in climate-controlled conference rooms 4,000 miles north of where the actual consequences played out. The emergence timeline was laid out in detail. Year 2090, supply cutoff begins. All shipments cease, all planted caches stop being restocked, all embedded agents activate and begin the next phase. Year 2091, anticipated famine conditions across 70% of monitored settlements. Faction warfare, escalating. Projected casualties 30 to 40 million. Year 2092, first emergence teams arrive with relief supplies, establish forward operating bases, begin recruitment of local auxiliaries. Year 2093, formal integration begins. The Arctic Commonwealth announces its existence, offers membership to surviving factions on our terms. Those who accept get food, medicine, security. Those who refuse get nothing and face starvation or conquest by neighbors who did accept. By 2095, they project complete integration, 15 million Commonwealth citizens managing a continental economy powered by 40 million wastelander laborers who'll be grateful just to be alive. They even have the propaganda planned. We'll be the civilization that survived, that preserved the old world's knowledge and technology while the surface descended into barbarism. We'll offer wastelanders a chance to join the future, to leave behind the chaos and violence of the wasteland for the order and prosperity of the Commonwealth. And they'll accept because the alternative will be death. 3 years of engineered famine will make sure of that. If this story has kept you listening this far, and you want more of these dark confessions from the wasteland, hit that like button. It really motivates me to create similar Fallout lores. I tried to talk to someone before I ran, just one person, my closest colleague, someone I'd worked with for 15 years. I thought if I could make just one other person understand, maybe we could find a way to stop this together. I waited until we were alone in the data center, made sure no surveillance was recording, and I told her what I'd found. I showed her the casualty projections, the disease schedules, the emergence plans. She looked at the data for a long time. Then she looked at me and said, "So?" I asked her how she could be okay with this, with killing millions of people who didn't even know we existed. She said, "They weren't people. Not really. Not anymore." 200 years of radiation and mutation and FEV exposure had changed them into something else, something that looked human but was genetically compromised. The Commonwealth was pure, she said, uncontaminated. We had a responsibility to reclaim the world and remake it properly, and if that meant clearing out the mutants first, well, that's just efficient planning. I realized then that I was the anomaly, not her. Everyone else in the Commonwealth had been raised with this worldview from childhood. We were taught that we were the true humans, the preserved ones, that our genetic modifications were enhancements, while wastelander mutations were degradations. We were civilization, and they were remnants. We were the future, and they were barely the past. The programming went so deep that showing people evidence of mass murder just made them shrug and say it was necessary for the greater good. That's when I knew I had to run. Not because I thought I could stop the plan. I'm not that delusional. One person can't derail 2 centuries of preparation and infrastructure. But I could warn people. I could give the wasteland 3 years to prepare instead of 0. I could provide evidence that proves the supply chains aren't natural, that the faction conflicts are engineered, that independence is possible if you know what you're fighting against. The hard part is going to be making anyone believe me. I'm a dying stranger with a story that sounds like radiation-induced paranoia and data chips that could be elaborate fakes. Why would anyone trust me? Why would major factions reorganize their entire economies based on the word of someone who could be a con artist or a lunatic? I've been trying to figure that out for 3 weeks while my body slowly cooks itself from the inside. I've made copies of the most critical data and started distributing them to people I think might actually do something. Not the obvious choices, not the faction leaders who are probably compromised or too invested in current systems to accept the truth. I'm going after the second tier, the people who have influence but aren't important enough to have Commonwealth agents watching them, merchants who actually care about their communities, scientists who ask uncomfortable questions, Brotherhood scribes who study pre-war records and might notice inconsistencies, Minutemen who remember what it means to protect people instead of control them. Each time I hand over a data chip, I tell them the same thing: verify everything independently. Don't trust me just because I'm dying. And whatever you do, start building local supply chains now. Food production, water purification, ammunition manufacturing, medicine synthesis, everything you currently get through trade needs to have a local alternative before 2090. Because once the cutoff happens, there won't be time to build infrastructure while people are starving. Some of them listen, most don't. I watched a caravan master in Freeside look at the supply route data for 30 seconds before handing it back and telling me he didn't have time for conspiracy theories. A Brotherhood paladin in Hidden Valley reviewed the weapons cache locations and said it was obviously fake because nobody could coordinate that many placements across 2 centuries. A Crimson Caravan logistics officer laughed when I showed her the distribution patterns and said I was just describing normal trade networks. The problem is that the Commonwealth's manipulation is so thorough, so embedded in how the wasteland works, that explaining it sounds insane. Of course, major caravan companies have extensive supply networks. Of course, pre-war military bases still yield useful salvage. Of course, factions fight over resources and territory. That's just reality, right? Trying to convince people that their entire economic system was designed by a hidden civilization sounds like the ravings of someone who's been eating too many glowing mushrooms. But a few people believed me. A doctor in Westside who'd noticed that certain plagues followed suspicious patterns. A former gunrunner machinist who'd always wondered why their supposedly original designs kept matching schematics from pre-war facilities that shouldn't have had those weapons. A NCR ranger who'd found it strange that ammunition shortages always seemed to hit right before major battles, forcing both sides to negotiate instead of fight to conclusion. Those people, the ones who'd already noticed something was wrong but couldn't put the pieces together, they're the ones I'm hoping will make a difference. I gave them everything. Database access codes, supply route manifests, agent identification protocols, emergence timeline documents, genetic markers that identify Commonwealth citizens from wastelanders. Everything they'd need to start unraveling the conspiracy and building resistance. The genetic markers are particularly important. Commonwealth citizens have specific modifications that show up in blood work if you know what to look for. Enhanced cold resistance, modified hemoglobin, altered metabolic rates. The changes are subtle enough that wasteland doctors wouldn't notice them without specific testing. But once you know what to look for, you can identify our people. I provided the testing protocols and a list of known agents. Some of them are going to be shocks. That respected merchant in the hub, who's been a pillar of the community for 40 years, Commonwealth agent, 2nd generation. His parents were part of the initial infiltration wave in 2009. The head of agricultural research at the NCR's experimental farms, one of ours, ensuring their crop development stays dependent on seeds we provide. The quartermaster at the Citadel who manages Brotherhood equipment requisitions, embedded agent making sure their salvage finds match our strategic goals. I don't know what happens when people start testing and discovering how deep the infiltration goes. Probably paranoia, witch hunts, innocent people accused because they have unusual blood chemistry from radiation or FEV exposure. But that's better than the alternative, which is letting the Commonwealth's agents remain hidden and active when the emergence begins. At least, if people are suspicious, they'll be harder to manipulate. The economic preparation is what really matters, though. I've been trying to explain to anyone who'll listen that they need to break their dependency on northern trade immediately. Every settlement should be developing local food production beyond subsistence farming. Every community needs water purification that doesn't rely on imported filters or chemicals. Every faction needs ammunition manufacturing that uses locally sourced materials. Medicine is harder. Some compounds require sophisticated chemistry, but even there, alternatives exist if people are willing to learn. The followers of the apocalypse understood immediately when I showed them the data. They've been trying to spread knowledge and reduce dependency on pre-war technology for decades. They saw the supply manipulation patterns and recognized it for what it was. They're already working to expand their medical training programs, teaching people to synthesize antibiotics from local fungal sources, developing surgical techniques that don't require advanced equipment. If any group survives the cutoff intact, it'll be communities the followers have been working with. But the followers are small, their reach is limited, and 3 years isn't enough time to teach an entire continent how to be self-sufficient. Most settlements will still be dependent on trade when the cutoff happens. Most factions will still need outside weapons and ammunition. Most communities will still be one bad harvest away from famine, which means the Commonwealth's plan will mostly work, and tens of millions will die before the survivors are desperate enough to accept any terms offered. I've been trying to think if there's any way to actually stop the emergence instead of just mitigating it. The obvious answer is to attack the Arctic Commonwealth directly, destroy our infrastructure before we can deploy south. But that's essentially impossible. The vaults are too deep, too well defended, connected by tunnel networks that span thousands of miles. You'd need a coordinated assault from multiple points simultaneously, and you'd need to know exactly where to hit to cripple our capability. I included the vault locations and infrastructure maps in the data I distributed. All 30 vaults, their connecting tunnels, their power systems, their manufacturing centers, everything. If someone wanted to organize a strike, they'd have the intelligence needed. But who could pull it off? The Brotherhood doesn't have the numbers, the NCR doesn't have the reach, the Institute doesn't have the motivation. No single faction has the capability to threaten us, and getting multiple factions to cooperate is exactly what we've been preventing for 2 centuries. Maybe that's the real answer though. Not attacking the Commonwealth, but doing what we've been working so hard to prevent: unification. If the NCR, Brotherhood, Minutemen, Railroad, even the Institute could be convinced to work together, if they could combine resources and knowledge and military capability, they might be strong enough to survive the cutoff and resist the emergence, not by fighting us directly, but by achieving genuine independence that makes our offers of assistance irrelevant. That's the scenario the Strategic Council fears most, according to the documents I read. United Wasteland Resistance isn't in any of their projected outcome models, because they've spent 2 centuries ensuring it could never happen. Every faction manipulation, every engineered conflict, every resource shortage, all designed to keep everyone divided and fighting each other instead of looking north. If the wasteland somehow unified despite everything we've done to prevent it, the emergence plan falls apart. Of course, getting traditional enemies to cooperate is easier said than done, especially when some of them have Commonwealth agents in leadership positions actively working to prevent exactly that. And you'd need proof, real, undeniable evidence that the conspiracy exists and that cooperation is the only survival strategy. My data chips are a start, but they're not enough. People need to see the truth in action. That's why I've been trying to arrange a demonstration. There's a supply cache in the Mojave that's scheduled for discovery by an NCR patrol in 2 months. The cache contains 50 crates of military-grade weapons and ammunition, all manufactured in Arctic Commonwealth facilities within the last year, but aged and weathered to appear pre-war. The patrol route, the cache location, the discovery timing, everything is already planned by our logistics division. It's a perfect example of how we seed weapons into the wasteland. I gave the cache location, the patrol route, and the timing to 3 different groups: an NCR ranger I trust, a Brotherhood paladin who believed my story, and a followers researcher who wants to document everything. If they all show up when the patrol makes their scheduled discovery, they'll witness the manipulation happening in real time. They'll see NCR soldiers finding weapons they think are pre-war salvage, not knowing that the whole thing was staged. And if the Brotherhood and followers are there to test the weapons and prove their recent manufacture, that might be enough to start breaking through the denial. It's a small thing, 1 cache out of hundreds we plant every year, but sometimes you need a small, provable truth to make people believe the larger horror. If we can prove one manipulation, people might start accepting that all the others are real too. And if enough people start questioning where their supplies really come from, maybe the cutoff won't be as devastating as the Commonwealth projects. The disease releases are harder to prove because we've been doing them for so long that they blend into the background radiation of wasteland life. Everyone's used to plagues appearing randomly, killing hundreds or thousands, then fading away. Nobody questions it because disease is just part of survival now. But I found patterns in the outbreak data that might be traceable. Certain strains only appear in specific regions. Infection rates that are too consistent to be natural. Timing that correlates with population density exceeding target levels. I gave that data to medical researchers in multiple settlements, hoping someone would start asking why plagues behave like someone's controlling them. If enough doctors start comparing notes, if they realize that outbreaks aren't random but follow patterns that suggest deliberate release, maybe they'll start implementing quarantine procedures that actually work. Maybe they'll develop tests that can identify engineered pathogens versus natural ones. Maybe they'll be ready when we release the final wave, the big one planned for 2089 to soften up populations right before the cutoff. That's the one that keeps me awake at night, the little sleep I can still manage through the pain. The final pathogen release, codenamed Harvest Protocol, designed to kill 30 million people in 6 months. It's not one disease. It's 12 different engineered strains released simultaneously across the continent, each optimized for different climates and populations. Respiratory variants for dense urban areas, waterborne strains for settlements dependent on rivers, insect-vectored diseases for agricultural regions. All of them modified to be highly lethal but slow spreading, giving them time to thoroughly saturate target populations before symptoms become obvious. The Harvest Protocol is scheduled to begin in 18 months, just enough time for the diseases to run their course before the supply cutoff, making sure populations are already weakened and desperate when the food stops coming. The Commonwealth calls it humane, ensuring people die from illness rather than starvation, like that makes mass murder somehow acceptable. I call it what it is, genocide, with a smile and a syringe. I distributed the Harvest Protocol documents to every medical facility I could reach. The followers, the NCR's Medical Corps, even the Institute's Biology Division. Someone needs to develop countermeasures, vaccines, or treatments that can stop the 12 strains before they're released. It's possible. The pathogens are engineered, which means they have specific vulnerabilities. But it requires time and resources and coordination, all the things the wasteland is bad at because we've spent 2 centuries making sure they stay bad at it. Here's something that'll make you think differently about every merchant. You meet what if the person selling you food or medicine or weapons is actually deciding whether you live or die based on quotas from 4,000 miles away? What would you do if you found out your survival was never about your strength or luck or skill, but about whether you fit into someone else's economic model? How do you fight an enemy that's been invisible your entire life, that shaped everything you think is natural and inevitable? The personal cost of all this keeps hitting me in waves. I gave up everything for this warning. My home, my family, my future, what little of it I had left. I'm dying alone in a wasteland I barely understand, trying to save people who mostly think I'm crazy, fighting against a plan that's probably going to succeed anyway. There are moments, usually at night, when the pain gets really bad, where I wonder if I should have just taken the genetic therapy and lived out my life in comfortable ignorance. But then I remember reading those outbreak reports, seeing the names and ages of people killed by diseases we released. Children who never got to grow up because they were born in settlements that exceeded optimal population density. Families destroyed because we needed to fragment trade networks. Communities that almost achieved something beautiful before we crushed them with engineered catastrophes. All of it calculated, deliberate, planned in comfortable offices by people who never had to watch the consequences of their decisions. I can't fix what we did. I can't bring back the millions we've already killed, or undo 2 centuries of manipulation, but I can make sure the next 3 years don't go according to plan. I can give people a chance to prepare, to resist, to survive with their dignity intact instead of begging us for scraps. Maybe that's worth dying for in a climate my body calls murder. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm genetically modified to survive extreme cold and I'm dying from warmth. The Commonwealth designed us to be the perfect Arctic population, completely adapted to life in frozen underground cities. We can survive temperatures that would kill normal humans in minutes. Our blood carries oxygen more efficiently in cold air. Our metabolism generates heat so effectively that we can walk through blizzards in light clothing. We're perfect for the Arctic and completely unsuited for anywhere else. It's a form of control I never recognized until I left. By modifying us so thoroughly for cold climate survival, they ensured we could never leave, never question, never escape. The whole world could be habitable, but we'd still need to stay in the Arctic because our own genetics trap us there. I'm dying because I tried to break free from a prison built into my DNA. There's something poetic about that, though I'm too tired and in too much pain to figure out exactly what. My skin is burning right now, even though the temperature in this room is comfortable for everyone else. My fever is 40.2 Celsius and climbing. The doctors say my immune system is attacking my own organs because it thinks the heat is a pathogen. They've tried everything they can think of, but there's no treatment for genetic incompatibility with your environment. I'm essentially experiencing a very slow allergic reaction to being alive outside the Arctic, and all they can do is manage the pain while my body destroys itself. I have maybe 10 days left now, less than I thought. The kidney failure is progressing faster than expected. Soon, I'll need dialysis to survive, and I've already decided I'm not doing that. This isn't a life worth extending artificially. I'd rather spend my last days conscious and mobile, distributing the last of my evidence, trying to convince a few more people that the threat is real. Once I can't walk anymore, once the pain gets too bad to think clearly, I'll find somewhere quiet and let nature take its course. But before that happens, I need to tell you who I am, because it matters. Not for my sake, I'll be dead and forgotten soon enough, but because my identity proves the conspiracy in a way that data chips alone cannot. I'm not some low-level clerk who stumbled onto classified files. I'm not a disgruntled employee making up stories. I was Lieutenant Commander Ingrid Solheim, Arctic Commonwealth Logistics Division, Strategic Analysis Department, with security clearance high enough to access operational plans and infiltration databases. I designed the supply routes that kept the wasteland alive for 200 years, and I just discovered they were leashes, not lifelines. I optimized the distribution networks that made your survival possible while ensuring you could never be free. I tracked the population metrics that determined which communities lived and which ones received engineered plagues. For 20 years, I was part of the machine that's been controlling your world, and I never knew it until they tried to erase my memory for asking questions. My name and credentials are on every data chip I distributed, along with biometric verification that proves I am who I say I am. Commonwealth citizens have genetic markers that can be tested and confirmed. My blood work will show the cold climate modifications, the enhanced hemoglobin, the metabolic alterations that mark me as Arctic adapted. Any competent scientist can verify my claims by testing my DNA against the protocols I provided. I'm not asking you to trust my word. I'm asking you to trust the evidence. If this confession meant something to you, leave a like. It's the only way I know you liked the video. In 10 days I'll be dead, and this warning will be all that's left of me. I don't know if it'll be enough. I don't know if anyone will believe it in time to matter. I don't know if the wasteland can break its dependency on Commonwealth supplies before the cutoff happens. But I know I tried, and I know the truth is out there now for anyone willing to look at it. Honestly, the Arctic Commonwealth is coming. In 3 years, every caravan will wake to empty warehouses. In 3 years, every faction will watch their supply lines collapse. In 3 years, 40 million people will start dying, and my former colleagues will call it integration through necessity. But it doesn't have to go that way. You have 3 years to prepare, to build alternatives, to achieve the independence we've been preventing. Find the supply sources and replace them. Build local production and stockpile resources. Create networks that don't depend on northern goods. Test people for Commonwealth genetic markers and root out our agents. Develop vaccines for the Harvest Protocol diseases. Unite the factions before the emergence forces you to unite under our control. You can survive this, but only if you start now and you take the threat seriously. I'm dying because my genes won't let me survive below the Arctic Circle, but I'll freeze in the wasteland before I let them. Turn it into a colony. My last act of defiance is this warning, this evidence, this refusal to let them win without a fight. What you do with it is up to you now. I've done everything I can. The rest is in your hands. 3 years until the cold comes, and I don't mean winter. I've been keeping a journal these last few weeks, documenting everything that happens as my body fails. Not for myself, I won't be around to read it, But for anyone who finds this recording and wants proof that every word was true, the progression of symptoms matches exactly what the Commonwealth's genetic research predicted would happen to our people in warm climates. It's like watching a medical textbook play out in my own failing organs, each stage arriving right on schedule. Day 1, after leaving the Arctic, mild discomfort, skin sensitivity, slightly elevated temperature. Day 7, persistent fever, joint inflammation, early signs of kidney stress. Day 14, severe pain, organ function declining, immune system malfunction. Day 21, multiple organ failure, neurological symptoms beginning, estimated survival time less than 72 hours. I'm currently on day 23 and I shouldn't still be conscious. But spite is a powerful motivator. The doctors at the old Mormon fort have been fascinated in a clinical sort of way. They've never seen anything like my condition because they've never encountered someone genetically modified for Arctic survival trying to live in the Mojave. They've documented everything, taken samples, recorded the progression. When I die, they're going to autopsy me, and I've given them permission because maybe understanding how Commonwealth genetics work will help people identify our agents. Every part of my death can be useful if it helps expose the conspiracy. I gave them the genetic modification protocols from the Commonwealth databases, the specific alterations we make to adapt people for extreme cold, the markers that show up in blood work and tissue samples, the metabolic signatures that differentiate us from natural-born wastelanders. It's all documented now in multiple locations. The followers have it, the NCR Medical Corps has it, even some Brotherhood scribes I managed to contact. When the Commonwealth emerges and tries to blend their people into wasteland populations, there will be tests available to identify them. That's assuming anyone uses the information. Assuming people believe it's real and not some elaborate hoax. I've been fighting that battle for 3 weeks now, and I'm not winning. For every person who takes the evidence seriously, 10 more dismiss it as paranoia or delusion. The wasteland has been living with Commonwealth manipulation for so long that it feels like natural reality, and trying to convince people their entire world is a carefully managed experiment sounds impossible. But I've found allies. Real ones, people who looked at the evidence and understood immediately what it meant. A former Enclave scientist who recognized the disease patterns because he'd worked on biological weapons before the Enclave collapsed. A NCR intelligence officer who'd been investigating suspicious supply irregularities for years without knowing what he was really seeing. A Brotherhood elder who remembered finding pre-war caches that seemed too convenient, too perfectly stocked with exactly what they needed right when they needed it. Those people are forming a network now, quietly sharing information and running their own investigations. They're testing the predictions I gave them, verifying that supply routes match my data, confirming that outbreak patterns follow the schedules I provided. Each verification makes the conspiracy more real, harder to dismiss. It's slow work, and 3 years isn't much time, but it's happening. The truth is spreading, even if most people aren't ready to hear it yet. The cache demonstration I arranged is happening tomorrow. I won't be there to see it. I can barely walk now, and the pain makes concentration difficult, but I've given detailed instructions to everyone involved. The NCR patrol will arrive at the coordinates at 0800 hours, exactly as planned by Commonwealth Logistics. The Brotherhood observers will be in position to document everything. The followers' scientists will be ready to test the weapons and prove their recent manufacture despite their appearance. If it works, if people witness the manipulation happening in real time, it might be the tipping point that makes the larger conspiracy believable. One undeniable proof that opens minds to accepting the rest of the evidence. Or maybe it won't matter. Maybe people will explain it away somehow, find reasons to reject what their own eyes show them. I don't know anymore. I'm too tired and in too much pain to predict how people will react. What I do know is that I've created something the Commonwealth never expected, a documented trail of evidence that can't be easily erased. The data is distributed too widely now, copied and stored in too many locations across too many factions. Even if they kill everyone who currently has it, the information exists in archives that will outlast any immediate purge. Future generations will find it, even if the current one refuses to believe. And the Commonwealth will know I did this. They're monitoring wasteland communications. They have agents embedded everywhere. They'll hear about the dying Arctic woman spreading conspiracy theories. They probably already know, which means they'll adjust their plans, change their timelines, maybe accelerate the emergence or delay it. I've introduced chaos into their carefully ordered system, and they hate chaos. Good. Let them scramble. Let them worry that their 2-century plan might be compromised by one person who refused to have her memory erased. I wonder sometimes what happened to my colleague, the one I tried to confide in before I ran. Did she report me immediately? Did she feel any guilt about condemning me to genetic therapy? Or did she genuinely believe she was helping, saving me from dangerous thoughts that would only bring me pain? The Commonwealth is good at making people believe that conformity is kindness, that erasing dissent is mercy. She probably sleeps well at night thinking she did the right thing. My family is up there too. Parents and siblings I'll never see again. They think I'm dead by now, lost to a maintenance tunnel accident or suicide brought on by work stress. The Commonwealth doesn't admit when people escape. It's too embarrassing, too suggestive that something might be wrong with the perfect Arctic society. So they'll have told my family I died, and they'll have believed it because the alternative is too frightening to consider, that their daughter, their sister, chose death over loyalty to the Commonwealth. I hope someday they learn the truth. I hope they find out what I did and why, even if they can't forgive me for it. I hope they question everything they were taught, every comfortable lie they've been living with. I hope my escape plants seeds of doubt that grow into full resistance, that my family becomes part of the problem for the Strategic Council instead of part of their obedient workforce. Probably wishful thinking, but I'm dying. I'm allowed a few impossible hopes. The pain is getting worse. The doctors offered me stronger medication, but it makes me too foggy to think clearly, and I need to finish this. There are still things I need to say, warnings I haven't given yet, details that might save lives if anyone's actually listening. The neurological symptoms are starting now. Tremors in my hands, difficulty focusing my eyes, moments where I lose track of what I was saying. The end is close. Here's something important that I haven't emphasized enough. The Commonwealth isn't evil in the cartoon villain sense. They're not cackling madmen who torture people for fun. They genuinely believe they're saving humanity, preserving civilization, doing what's necessary for the greater good. Every person involved in Operation Tundra thinks they're the hero of this story. That's what makes them so dangerous. Evil you can fight, but righteousness, backed by 2 centuries of careful planning and unlimited resources, that's almost impossible to resist. The Strategic Council members I read about in the files, they have families and hobbies and pets. They celebrate holidays and fall in love and worry about their children's futures. They're normal people who happen to believe that 40 million deaths are acceptable losses in service of rebuilding proper civilization. They've convinced themselves that wastelanders aren't really people anymore, that radiation and mutation have degraded them into something less than human, something that can be managed and controlled and culled when necessary for optimal outcomes. That belief system is built into Commonwealth education from childhood. We're taught that we're the pure ones, the preserved humans, the last hope for the species. Everyone outside the Arctic is compromised, contaminated, gradually becoming something other than human. It's not hate, it's pity, mixed with superiority and a sense of duty. We're the gardeners, and they're the weeds, and proper gardening requires selective culling. When you frame genocide as garden maintenance, people sleep fine at night. Breaking that programming took seeing the actual human cost in those outbreak reports, reading about children dying, families destroyed, communities shattered, all described in clinical language that tried to erase the humanity of the victims. The disconnect between the statistics and the reality finally cracked something in me that all the education and conditioning had built. But most Commonwealth citizens will never see those reports, never have that moment of horrified clarity. They'll participate in the emergence believing they're saving the wasteland, not conquering it. That's why the infiltration is so deep and so effective. Our agents aren't spies in the traditional sense. They're missionaries, spreading Commonwealth values and dependence without even realizing that's what they're doing. They genuinely want to help wastelanders. They just define help as making you dependent on us so we can guide you toward proper civilization. They build relationships and have children and integrate into communities while slowly, subtly ensuring those communities can never be truly independent. Some of them don't even know they're agents. 3rd and 4th generation sleepers born in the wasteland, raised by parents who were themselves born outside the Arctic, but still carrying the values and mission that their grandparents brought south. They think they're wastelanders. They have no conscious loyalty to the Commonwealth, but their actions still serve our interests because that's how they were raised to think. The perfect infiltration is the one where even the infiltrators don't know what they are. How do you fight that? How do you resist an influence so subtle and pervasive that it shapes your thoughts without you realizing? I don't have good answers. Testing for genetic markers will find the intentional agents, but not the cultural ones. Rejecting all outside trade will lead to unnecessary suffering when some of those supplies are genuinely helpful. The paranoia required to root out all Commonwealth influence would tear wasteland society apart as effectively as the emergence itself. Maybe the answer is just awareness, knowing the manipulation exists, understanding how it works, consciously choosing to build alternatives, even when they're harder than accepting what's offered. Independence isn't about rejecting everything from outside. It's about having real choices, genuine options, the ability to say no without facing starvation. If the wasteland can achieve that before the cutoff, the Commonwealth's leverage disappears. I've been thinking about what happens after I'm gone, after my body finally gives up and the fever wins. Will anyone remember this warning? Will it matter in 3 years when the supplies stop coming? Or will it be forgotten as the ramblings of a dying woman who was probably irradiated or mentally ill? I don't get to know, and that's the hardest part. I'm making this sacrifice without any guarantee it'll mean anything. But I suppose that's what faith is, acting without certainty because the alternative is worse. I have faith that somewhere among all the people I talked to, all the data chips I distributed, all the warnings I gave, something will take root and grow. One community will achieve food independence. One faction will develop local ammunition production. One doctor will create a vaccine that stops a harvest protocol disease. Small victories that accumulate into survival. The followers seemed most likely to succeed. They're already focused on education and self-sufficiency, already working to spread knowledge instead of hoarding it. When I gave them the Commonwealth data, they didn't question whether it was real. They immediately started planning how to use it. They're teaching people to synthesize medicines from wasteland flora, to build water purifiers from scavenged parts, to create ammunition from locally available materials. If any group preserves this knowledge and acts on it effectively, it'll be them. I told them about the harvest protocol in detail, gave them samples of my blood so they could study Commonwealth genetic engineering techniques, provided every schematic and formula I could access. If they can reverse engineer our biological weapons, they might be able to develop broad-spectrum treatments that work against multiple strains. It's a long shot. Engineering countermeasures takes time and resources they don't have much of, but it's possible. And possibility is all I can offer at this point. The NCR has resources, but they're bureaucratic and slow to change. I gave their intelligence division everything they need to identify Commonwealth agents in their government and military, but I don't know if they'll act on it. There's political risk in accusing respected officials of being foreign agents, especially when the foreign power doesn't officially exist. They might file my evidence away and forget about it until the emergence actually happens. Or they might surprise me and take it seriously enough to start purging compromised personnel. The Brotherhood is paranoid enough to believe the conspiracy, but isolated enough that it might not matter. They'll probably use my information to justify their existing policies of technological hoarding and isolationism. They'll test people for genetic markers and exile anyone who fails. They'll reject all outside supplies and manufacture everything locally. They'll survive the cutoff better than most factions, but they won't help anyone else survive. That's just who they are. The Institute is the wild card. They have the scientific capability to verify everything I've claimed and the resources to do something about it. But they're also the faction most similar to the Commonwealth in mindset, the most likely to see the logic in our approach, even if they don't like being on the receiving end of it. They might decide to negotiate with the Commonwealth instead of resisting, trading their synthetic human technology for favorable terms in the integration. Or they might see us as competition and fight to protect their own vision of humanity's future. I wish I could see how it all plays out. I wish I could know whether this warning mattered, whether anyone survived because of what I did, but I'm out of time. The kidney failure is complete now, toxins building up in my blood, mental clarity fading in and out. The doctors say hours, not days. They're keeping me comfortable, and that's all anyone can do at this point. My last coherent act is finishing this, recording, making sure the full story exists somewhere, documented in my own words, available for anyone who wants to understand what the Arctic Commonwealth is and what they're planning. I've told you everything I know, given you every warning I can, provided evidence that proves the conspiracy is real. What happens next is up to you. If you're hearing this, you have time to prepare. Not much, but some. 3 years minus however long it took for this recording to reach you. Use it. Build local supply chains. Develop independence. Root out Commonwealth agents. Prepare for diseases that will seem natural but aren't. Unite factions that have been kept divided deliberately. The emergence is coming whether you believe me or not, but you can choose to face it on your feet instead of on your knees. I designed the supply routes that kept you alive and dependent for 200 years. I optimized the systems that made your survival possible while ensuring you could never be free. I tracked the metrics that determined who lived and who received engineered death. And when I learned the truth, I chose to die in your wasteland rather than live in the Commonwealth's comfortable lies. That has to mean something. It has to matter. My name is Lieutenant Commander Ingrid Solheim of the Arctic Commonwealth Logistics Division. I was born in Vault 7 North in the year 2046. I spent 41 years believing I was helping you. I spent 3 weeks dying to warn you, and in approximately 6 hours, give or take, my genetically modified body will finally shut down completely because I committed the crime of seeking warmth when I was designed for eternal cold. The cold is coming for all of you in 3 years. Not weather, not winter, the Arctic Commonwealth, and they've been planning your subjugation since before your grandparents were born. But you know now. You have evidence, you have time, you have a choice. Make it count. This is my confession, my warning, my last act of rebellion against the machine I served for most of my life. I hope it's enough. I hope someone listens. I hope the wasteland survives what's coming and tells the Commonwealth to freeze in their perfect underground cities while you build something better up here in the light. 3 years. The clock is ticking. Don't waste it.